In this example, I want to show you how we can use a drop shadow layer effect and use it to illustrate a concept. I'm going to start out with this. So we have a mosquito, some text, and a background texture. First thing I want to do is on the mosquito layer is add a drop shadow. I'll double click to the right of the layer name, add a drop shadow, and I'm going to use these values for that drop shadow. Blend mode of multiply, color of black, opacity of 75, we'll have an angle of 90, distance of 3, size of 7. I'll click OK. Now, having added the drop shadow, I'm going to separate the drop shadow. I'll come and right click on FX and choose Create Layer. I now have a completely independent shadow layer. On this shadow layer, I will distort it. Command or Control T gives me my transformation rectangle, and I'll start out by doing a perspective distortion, Command Option Shift, pulling on that bottom handle, and then I'm just going to distort it in a freeform way, holding down the Command key and pulling on those handles. Press Return to commit to that transformation. Now, having done that, I'd like to change the color of the shadow, and I'm going to do it with a layer effect. Of course, there are other ways to do it, but this is all about layer effects. So let's see how we can do it with a layer effect, and the one that we want is color overlay. I'll check color overlay, and this is the color that I want. I want a deep red and an opacity of 60%, but what's not working for me here is that this color overlay is affecting the whole composition rather than just the mosquito layer. So I'll click on blending options and check transparency shapes layer. Now that I can see this in context, I think I want to just reduce the opacity of that somewhat. Now I want to do something similar to the text. I want to distort it in a similar way. But rather than approach it in the same way as I did for the mosquito, I'm going to do it differently with the text because I want the text to remain editable. I will convert it to a smart object. Right click on the layer, convert to smart object. And I can now distort it, Command or Control T, Command Option Shift, and make a perspective distortion. And then I'm just going to pull from the bottom center handle and then from the bottom top handle and create myself a distorted layer like that. I would like the type to have a gradient applied to it, and for that gradient to fade to transparency at the top of the type. And I'm going to do this with a gradient overlay layer effect. So we'll double click to the right of the layer name, add gradient overlay, and you can see that that's not really changing things. Crucially, what I need to do here is I need to use my blending options. Blending options, and I'm going to take the fill opacity down to 0 so that all we're left with is the opacity of the gradient overlay itself. So now when I come back to this, we can see that I'm much closer to what I'm after. To adjust the position of the gradient overlay, I can move my cursor onto the composition and I can drag that up or down to determine how abruptly it fades to transparency. And I think I'm also going to increase the opacity. Now, I would also like the type to be somewhat blurred, and I'm going to do that by applying a filter. And I can apply a filter to the layer because it's a smart object. And I'm going to go with a 6 pixel Gaussian blur. Now let's come to the bottom color fill layer, and I'd like to add a gradient overlay to this to create a vignetting effect. I'll double click to the right of the layer name, gradient overlay, and this time, rather than using a linear gradient, I want it to be a radial gradient. And I'm also going to choose reverse so that it darkens the edges and is lighter in the center. I can change the position of that center point by moving onto my canvas and dragging the center point around. And I'm also going to increase the intensity of that by increasing the opacity to 57%. Lastly, I would like to add a bit more texture. Now I have this layer of texture at the top, but because the mosquito is solid black, that texture with a blend mode of overlay is just not affecting it at all. So I'm going to select these three layers, the mosquito, its shadow, and the type, and press Command or Control G to put them into a group. And I'm now going to apply a layer mask to that whole group. I'll hold down my Option or Alt key and show just that texture layer. Then come to my Channels panel, Command or Control click on the RGB channel to load the gray values, and then come back to my Layers panel where I can now turn back on the group and the color fill layer. I will select the group and then come and add a layer mask to that group. Now it's a bit too flat at the moment, so on that layer mask I will press Command or Control L and I will increase the contrast. I'm going to move the white point slider to the left, the gray point slider to the right, and the black point slider to the right as well. And there's our finished composition created with a drop shadow separated from its layer, two gradient overlays, and a color overlay.